For years, I've been asked the age-old question, how do I get better at Yu-Gi-Oh? And though it's not as simple as just do X, Y, and Z, there are quite a few things I noticed that some of the best players in the game do that the average player doesn't. And today I'll be sharing with you guys some of those secrets to help dramatically increase your win rate and just become a better player as a whole. The first thing I noticed that champions do is they're able to recognize a story being told in the game. And some of you might ask, what exactly does that even mean? Here's an example of making the story make sense. Our opponent just set a back row and passed back to us with 3 darks engraved but no particular plays. Our graveyard currently includes a Vayu, Sirocco, and a couple of other black wings and spells and traps. We draw MST for turn. In this spot, we're going to do the only play that we can, which is special summoning a armed wing. The reason we're not using our MST here is because we don't know which trap is live and we might just be throwing it away. So we're going to attack for 23 and our opponent does nothing. By doing so, we've now checked for a battle trap as well as a bottomless or a torrent, so we can likely rule those cards out. Our opponent takes 23, they draw their card for turn, and they set it and pass back to us. Here, we now know that our opponent likely doesn't have bottomless or mirror force. So the correct play is to actually activate our MST, targeting the new set. That's because this is the most likely card to have become a bottomless, mirror force, dimensional prison, etc. And it ends up being mirror force, now giving us an opportunity to go for lethal, and sure enough, this is game. This is just a very basic example of checking for cards and making a story make sense. It gets a lot more complex as more cards are introduced in each game, but is a core skill that all the best players have. You might say, but okay Marcus, what if no story's been told yet and I haven't checked for anything? What do I do then? And the answer to that is the ability to calculate risk. This is a bit complicated though, because not only do you have to be able to evaluate the risk, but you have to see what the risk versus the reward is and the potential outcomes that follow. Here's a very simple example of being able to evaluate risk versus reward and calculate risk simultaneously. So in this game, we're in game 2 against Black Wings playing our Chaos Fairy strategy with 3 fairies engraved, a Cyber Dragon in hand, and drawing into an orange light. Our opponent has 3 back row that have been set for an entire turn cycle, as well as a Yugioh that just took our Lila, and their Lila milled Brain Control, Gores, and a Solemn Judgment. So in this spot, we're able to eliminate Solemn Judgment being one of his sets. It's entirely possible he has a Starlight Road set as well. However, that card's normally not in an opponent's Blackwing deck, especially in game 2 against a fairy strategy that doesn't play much multiple removal cards outside of Heavy and maybe Treacherous Trap Hole. So in this spot, there's a few different options. We can summon the Cyber Dragon, punch over the Lila, and continue waiting. We can synchro into an Ancient Sacred Wyvern. Thus, if our opponent attacks with Yugioh, Yugioh would be 1, Wyvern would be 2, Wyvern could revive itself, and then Yugioh would not be reviving anything. But that's just playing to not lose the game. So though that might be slightly lower risk, it also does not have very much reward whatsoever. So the highest reward play here, and definitely worth the risk after deciding that there's no judgment and the likelihood of this going through is pretty good with the bottomless trap hole and torrential tribute in the grave, is to go for a Black Rose Dragon. By doing so, we can assume our opponent likely has some amount of draw traps set, and we have pretty good chances of this going through. So though there is the chance that we get Starlight Roaded and auto lose the game on the spot, we weren't probably winning this game regardless, and this was the reward was so high for this that it just makes sense to go for it. So our opponent does activate a draw trap, we nuke the board, and not only are we only a turn and a half behind, we also have 4 fairies engraved, giving us a very powerful play with Christia, or even an Enrise off the top with the Battle Fader being a Fiend. So you're playing to give yourself opportunities to win the game while simultaneously calculating risk. Here we have another example. You're playing Black Wings and your opponent draws for turn. They have a Darius on board, you have a Bora on board. And in this spot, your opponent activates Mystical Space Typhoon, targeting your Icarus attack. Your other 2 sets being Legacy, as well as Mirror Force. In this spot, far too often, I will see players activate the Icarus attack, tributing their monster, and targeting 2 cards on the opponent's side of the board, even knowing the opponent may have Starlight Road, as Gladiator Beast, especially post side against Blackwing, are known to have at least 2, as well as multiple trap stuns. This not only opens us up for attacks, but also just kind of puts us in a position where we are actually losing when we are actually ahead a card on the draw. And sure enough, our opponent would have it in this spot and we would lose the game. The other option that comes up is our opponent activates the MST, targets the Icarus, and we decide not to activate the Icarus and instead let it die. The reason for this is because the only card we're losing to in this spot would be a Waboku, and even if they have Waboku, we have the Mirror Force, so they'd have to have Waboku plus a trap stun or something of the sorts. So if our opponent attacked, we'd have the out. And then lastly, our opponent can activate the MST, target the Icarus, and in this spot, if we have already checked for cards like Trap Stun, we can also activate the Icarus, clearing our monster, targeting his card as well as her own legacy, chaining the legacy, and that would not only out the card, but we would also be ahead of draw. I don't like this in this spot particularly, as we don't have another normal summon to put on board, and it puts us in a dangerous spot for future plays. Also, if our opponent were to compulse and re-normal summon, we'd be forced to use our Mirror Force. But yeah, these are just spots where you have to calculate the risk of the cards you have. Just because your opponent is MSTing the Icarus and you have the opportunity to go +1 by chaining the Icarus, sometimes it's just better to let it die in this spot and understand the advantage that you're currently at. And those are just a couple examples on how calculating risk can really affect the outcome of a game. And it's something that all the best players have really got down packed to a science. To go hand in hand with that, the next tip is to just play a lot. The reason they're able to calculate risk in these situations and read stories so well is because they've seen the same stories and the same risk calculations over and over and over again. This is especially pertinent to players who haven't already put in a ton of hours, because there are some players that can get away with it who've already put in tons of hours into the game, and it's easier to get away with, especially with older formats. But in current format, for example, that's a game you have to constantly play to stay on top of and see all the new situations. Fortunately for us retro players, once you've put in the hours, you've kind of seen most of those situations and you won't have to continue putting in the same hours. To be honest, this is probably the biggest reason I don't play current anymore. Some of the biggest keys to getting better at the game have nothing to do with actually playing or how we look at the game. Some of them actually have to do with deck building and side deck choices. That's why one of the next secrets I wanted to share is having a plan with your side deck for every event that you're playing. For example, here I'll display on the screen what my general side deck plan for going first and going second across matchups looked like for Ultimate Time Wizard Orlando. And though this does have to remain flexible based on certain cards that you may see, it gives you a good game plan heading into each matchup, and it also just allows you to side deck faster, which oftentimes can be super beneficial. Another thing that the best players in the game do is something I like to call deck building, or better yet, metagaming with intent. This is typically done by diagnosing the meta to make better informed decisions on what deck you should play, or even just tech choices that may give you an edge in the competition. A recent example of this in Edison format that comes to mind is how people are starting to side more DD Crows and even main deck Royal Oppressions due to the rise of combo strategies like Forgs and Gigaplant. A more extreme version of this that comes to mind is at the TGS monthlies. We were having a lot of Blackwing players, and then all of a sudden a lot of people started switching to playing Machina just because it had a good Blackwing matchup, even though it was really sacrificing itself against Frogs. This concept of metagaming isn't exclusive to Edison either. It's virtually existed in every format of Yu-Gi-Oh you can think of. Some quick ones that come to mind are Fraser Smith winning a YCS with Gravekeepers in a monster-heavy format when they weren't popular, abusing cards like Royal Tribute and Necro Valley, or Billy Brake winning a YCS with Max C in the main and Tengu Plants when special summoning was really starting to pick up in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or even Patrick Hoban winning Nationals with Dragon Rulers and including cards like Vanity's Emptiness in the main deck to really counter other major special summoning strategies. And all of that is to show how beneficial being able to analyze the state of the format and metagaming can truly be. Honestly, there's so many more tips that I can think of that would help players get better, that pros do, that others don't. But I feel like I would be rambling this video way too long. So if that is something you guys are interested, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, later, my Meta Pros.